Rain hammered the jungle as Platoon Sergeant Mitchell Paige pressed himself low behind his Browning M 1917. The time, just past 2 o'clock in the morning. The date, October 26, 1942. His position, a muddy ridgeline overlooking Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Through the tropical downpour, he could make out flickering assembly lights dancing between the trees roughly 300 yards to his south. Paige was 24. For 6 years he'd lived and breathed machine gunnery. Right now, 33 Marines answered to him. And somewhere in that dark jungle, Japan's 17th Army was massing approximately 2,700 infantrymen from their 2nd Division, all with a single objective: reclaim Henderson Field. 2 months prior, the Marines had seized that airstrip. Japan wanted it back desperately. The equation was brutally simple. No Henderson Field meant no American bomber operations. No bombers meant Japanese supply lines operated freely. And free supply lines meant Japanese dominance across the Pacific Theatre. Paige had strategically placed 4 Browning M 1917 machine guns across a 1,500-yard defensive line running south of the airstrip. These weren't light weapons. Each one tipped the scales at 93 pounds empty, before you added water and ammunition. Their firing capacity was formidable. 450 rounds cycling through per minute. Standard doctrine called for 3-man crews to operate them efficiently. Every single Marine under Paige's command could strip these M1917s down to components blindfolded. In pitch darkness, they could dismantle the weapon, clean every part and rebuild it. Jams. They cleared them by touch alone, fingers working through the mechanics without sight. Paige had drilled this procedure into them relentlessly, hundreds upon hundreds of repetitions, because he knew combat would leave zero margin for error. The ridge Paige now defended represented the most vulnerable point in the entire American defensive perimeter. Break through here and Japanese forces would storm Henderson Field in under 20 minutes. Once they reached the airfield, every bomber, every fighter, every transport plane on the island would be destroyed. Guadalcanal would fall. Japan would lock down the supply corridor connecting the United States to Australia. This single ridge determined everything. Earlier that evening, Paige had improvised a rudimentary early warning system. He'd strung tripwire through the undergrowth, hanging empty ration cans at intervals along the line. Inside each can sat an empty cartridge. If enemy soldiers disturbed that wire, the cans would clatter. Crude. Absolutely. Effective. It would buy them maybe 30 seconds of advance warning before all hell broke loose. At 2:45 a.m., those cans began rattling. Japanese howitzers west of the Matanika River opened fire immediately. Shells detonated across the ridge, throwing mud skyward. Tree limbs exploded overhead. Shrapnel tore through the canopy in deadly arcs. The relentless rain transformed the ground into a sucking morass that made every movement a struggle. Below him, Paige could hear enemy infantry advancing through the jungle. They were singing. Cigarette smoke drifted up through the trees. Their confidence was palpable. They fully expected Henderson Field would be theirs before sunrise. The initial Japanese infantry wave emerged from the tree line at 3 a.m. sharp. Paige ordered his guns to open fire. All 4 M1917 erupted simultaneously. Red tracer rounds sliced through the darkness like laser beams. Japanese soldiers dropped in formation. The first wave collapsed entirely. The second wave climbed over the bodies and kept coming. The Marines had spent the afternoon zeroing their weapons. They knew the precise distance to every landmark, each tree, each bush, each depression in the terrain. The Japanese were advancing straight into a predetermined kill zone, walking into the exact scenario Paige had prepared for. But they kept advancing. They scaled walls of their own dead. They pushed through the machine gun fire without hesitation. Paige watched officers brandishing samurai swords, leading charges from the front. Bangalore torpedoes were being hauled forward to blast through the barbed wire barriers. Behind the first wave, hundreds more soldiers materialized from the jungle darkness. The sheer mass of humanity was staggering. For every enemy soldier cut down, 2 more emerged from the trees. By 4 a.m., 2 of Paige's 4 guns had been silenced. Japanese grenades had obliterated the crews. Blood mixed with rainwater in the gun emplacements, creating dark pools. Paige redistributed his surviving men to the 2 functioning weapons. He moved constantly along the ridge through the clinging mud, coordinating fire, clearing mechanical failures, replacing wounded gunners. A Japanese soldier materialized beside him, bayonet thrust forward. The blade carved deep into Paige's left hand, slicing nearly to the bone, almost severing multiple fingers. Paige rammed his K-bar knife into the attacker's throat and kept moving. By 5 a.m., only a single gun continued firing. By 5:30, Paige scanned left and right along his defensive position. Every Marine in his platoon was either dead or critically wounded. 32 men. He was the only one left standing. If you want to discover how Paige held this position single-handedly against 2,700 enemy soldiers, please hit that like button. It helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Paige. The Japanese were consolidating for another assault. Paige could hear officers barking orders through the darkness. Hundreds of boots squelched through the mud. He had one operational machine gun. Perhaps 2,000 rounds remained. Dawn and reinforcements were 10 hours away. Paige seized the Browning M 1917. The barrel radiated heat, glowing red from sustained firing. The water jacket was nearly dry. He had no crew to assist him. He would need to feed the ammunition belt, fire the weapon, and clear any mechanical failures completely alone, and the Japanese were coming again. The Browning M 1917 was engineered for 3-man operation at peak efficiency. One Marine fired and adjusted aim. Another fed the ammunition belt and cleared jams. A third hauled spare ammunition and water for the cooling jacket. The gun fired from a cloth belt containing 250 rounds. Each belt lasted 33 seconds under continuous fire. When empty, someone had to load a fresh belt while the gunner maintained his firing position. When the water jacket overheated, someone had to refill it or the barrel would warp permanently and the gun would seize. Paige had no one. He was gunner, loader, and ammunition bearer rolled into one. He would fire until empty, then reload while Japanese soldiers advanced through the darkness. He would fire until the water jacket began steaming, then crawl to find water while the barrel cooled. The system was impossible. He attempted it anyway. The next Japanese assault crashed into his position at 6 a.m. Paige opened fire. The weapon bucked against his shoulder, spent brass casings piled up around his boots. Tracers illuminated his targets. Japanese soldiers fell at 50 yards. More climbed over the corpses. The belt ran dry after 30 seconds. He grabbed a fresh belt with his right hand, his left hand still streaming blood from the bayonet wound. He loaded the belt into the feed mechanism one-handed while watching the enemy advance. 20 yards, 15 yards. He slammed the feed cover shut and resumed firing. The Japanese retreated. By 7 a.m., the barrel had become untouchable. Steam poured from the water jacket. Paige knew continued firing would destroy the gun permanently. He grabbed an empty canteen and crawled 15 feet to where a dead Marine lay face down in the mud. That Marine had a full canteen. Paige unscrewed it and poured water into the gun's cooling jacket. The water boiled instantly on contact. He poured more. The gun cooled just enough to remain functional. At 8 a.m., his primary gun jammed. A spent casing wedged itself in the receiver. Paige cleared it by feel in the darkness, but the gun jammed again after 3 more belts. The receiver was damaged. The weapon was finished. He abandoned it and crawled 30 yards through mud and corpses to where the second gun sat silent beside its dead crew. The gun itself was intact. He dragged it back to his position. 250 rounds remained in the belt. The Japanese attacked again at 9 a.m. Paige fired from the second gun. The barrel was cold. The water jacket was full. The gun performed flawlessly. He killed enemy soldiers at 40 yards, at 30, at 20. They kept coming. He could smell them now, sweat and gun smoke and blood. Their boots sucked in the mud. Officers shouted commands. The belt ran empty. He reloaded. The Japanese fell back again. Paige's hands trembled violently. Blood had soaked his entire left sleeve from the bayonet wound. Grenade shrapnel had punctured his right leg. He could barely see through the darkness and smoke. His ears rang constantly from hours of machine gun fire. He'd lost count of how many belts he'd fired. He'd lost count of how many enemy soldiers he'd killed. He only knew they kept attacking, and he kept firing. At 10 a.m., the second gun overheated. Paige crawled to find water. Every canteen within reach was empty. He'd already stripped the dead Marines of water hours ago. He remembered something from training, something desperate. He urinated into the water jacket. The gun cooled. He continued firing. By 11 a.m., Paige had been fighting alone for 6 hours. The sun was rising. He could finally see the battlefield clearly. Bodies carpeted the slope in front of his position, hundreds of them. The Japanese had pulled back to regroup. Paige used the pause to crawl to the third gun position. That crew was dead too. He dragged their ammunition back to his position. 12 belts, 3,000 rounds. He checked his remaining weapons. Gun 2 was still functional, though the barrel showed wear. Gun 3 had a damaged tripod, but the weapon itself operated. Gun 4 had been destroyed by a grenade. He now had 2 functional guns and 3,000 rounds. The Japanese had at least 2,000 soldiers remaining, and they were forming up for another assault. Paige observed them gathering in the tree line 400 yards south. Officers were organizing units. Soldiers were fixing bayonets. This would be the decisive push. They would throw everything at his position, and if Paige's guns failed, if ammunition ran out, if he made a single mistake, Henderson Field would fall before noon. The Japanese assault commenced at noon. This time, they attacked from 3 directions simultaneously. 200 soldiers charged straight up the slope toward Paige's position. Another 100 flanked left through the jungle. Another 100 flanked right. They were attempting to overwhelm him through pure numbers. They were forcing him to choose which direction to defend while the other attack succeeded. Paige chose all 3 directions. He fired gun 2 at the center assault until empty. While those Japanese took cover, he grabbed gun 3 and fired at the left flank 30-second bursts. He killed the lead elements and forced them back. Then he dropped gun 3 and returned to gun 2 with a fresh belt. The center assault had resumed. He fired again. The Japanese fell back. He switched to gun 3 for the right flank. He was moving between guns every 30 seconds, firing from different positions, creating the illusion that multiple machine gunners defended the ridge. The deception worked for 20 minutes. Then the Japanese officers realized only 1 gun fired at a time. They adjusted their tactics, coordinating all 3 attacks to hit simultaneously. Paige could only fire 1 gun. That meant 2 attacks would advance unopposed while he engaged the third. At 12:30 p.m., the right flank broke through. Japanese soldiers reached the ridgetop 70 yards from Paige's position. They were setting up a knee mortar. If that mortar opened fire, Paige was finished. He grabbed gun 3 and traversed right. He fired a full belt into the mortar team. They went down, but while he fired right, the center assault had advanced to 30 yards. He swung gun 3 back to center and fired. The Japanese dove for cover. Paige was losing. He could hold one position or another, but not both. The Japanese would eventually flank him and attack from behind. He needed help. He needed reinforcements. He needed anything. At 1 p.m., he heard American voices behind him. 2 rifle companies from the Battalion Reserve were advancing up the ridge. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller was personally leading them. Puller had brought 40 Marines to reinforce Paige's position. They spread out along the ridge and opened fire. The Japanese advance stalled. Puller crawled up to Paige's position. He surveyed the dead Marines. He surveyed the hundreds of Japanese corpses on the slope. He looked at Paige, covered in blood and mud, still firing the machine gun. Puller asked if Paige could hold until more reinforcements arrived. Paige said he could hold as long as ammunition lasted. The Marines dug in. Puller organized the defense. He positioned riflemen to cover the flanks. He brought up 2 more machine guns to support Paige's position. He called for artillery support from the batteries behind Henderson Field. Within 30 minutes, American 105mm howitzers were dropping shells on the Japanese assembly areas 400 yards south. The Japanese advance stopped, but Paige knew this was temporary. The Japanese still outnumbered the Americans 10-1. They still had fresh troops in the jungle. They would attack again. And when they did, Paige would be right back where he started, alone behind a machine gun fighting impossible odds. At 2 p.m., the Japanese launched another assault. This time they sent 500 soldiers straight up the middle. No flanking maneuvers, no tactics, just mass. They were betting that sheer numbers would overwhelm the American position. They were probably right. The howitzers fired. Shells exploded in the Japanese ranks. Dozens fell. Hundreds kept coming. The Marine riflemen opened fire. More Japanese fell. More kept coming. They were within 50 yards now. Puller was yelling for everyone to hold positions. Paige was firing belt after belt into the advancing mass. At 40 yards, Paige's gun jammed. A spent casing stuck in the ejection port. He cleared it with his KABAR knife. The Japanese were at 30 yards. He loaded a fresh belt and fired. The gun worked for 10 seconds, then jammed again. The receiver was damaged from hours of continuous fire. The gun was finished. Paige looked at Puller. They both knew what came next. If the Japanese reached the ridge, they would overrun the position in hand-to-hand combat. The Marines would lose Henderson Field. The Americans would lose Guadalcanal. Everything they'd fought for over the past 2 months would be gone. Puller made a decision. He ordered everyone to fix bayonets. They were going to charge. 40 Marines were going to charge downhill into 500 Japanese soldiers. It was suicide. Puller asked who would lead the charge. Paige stood up. He'd been fighting for 12 hours straight. He'd held this ridge alone for 6 of those hours. He'd killed more enemy soldiers than he could count. His hands were destroyed. His leg was bleeding. He could barely stand. But he wasn't done fighting. He picked up his M1903 Springfield rifle. He fixed his bayonet and looked at the Japanese soldiers climbing the slope toward him. The bayonet charge began at 2:15 p.m. Paige went first. 40 Marines followed. They ran downhill through the mud toward 500 Japanese soldiers climbing up. The Japanese saw them coming and hesitated. They'd been attacking for 12 hours. They'd lost hundreds of men. They'd thrown wave after wave at this ridge, and every wave had been cut down by machine gun fire. Now the Americans were charging them. The hesitation lasted 3 seconds. Then Japanese officers started yelling orders and the soldiers raised their rifles. 500 rifles against 41 Marines running downhill with bayonets. The mathematics were simple. The Marines would die before they covered 30 yards. But something strange happened. The Japanese soldiers in the front ranks looked at the Marines charging toward them and looked at the hundreds of dead Japanese soldiers covering the slope behind them and made a calculation. They'd been attacking this position since 3 a.m., 11 hours. They'd sent wave after wave and every wave had been destroyed. Now the Marines who had killed all those men were charging directly at them with bayonets. The front ranks broke and ran. The officers tried to stop them. They drew their swords and screamed at the soldiers to hold positions. Some soldiers obeyed. Most did not. The entire front line of the Japanese assault collapsed. Men turned and ran back down the slope. The Marines kept charging. Paige hit the Japanese line at full speed. He drove his bayonet into the first soldier he reached. The blade went through the man's chest and stuck. Paige couldn't pull it free. He dropped the rifle and drew his KABAR knife. A Japanese soldier swung his rifle at Paige's head. Paige blocked with his left arm and drove the knife into the soldier's stomach. Another soldier came at him from the right. Paige kicked him in the knee and stabbed downward as the man fell. The Marines spread out along the slope. They were killing Japanese soldiers in close combat. Bayonets, knives, and rifle butts. The Japanese line broke completely. Soldiers were running back toward the jungle. Officers were trying to rally them, but the panic had spread. Within 5 minutes, the entire assault had dissolved into a rout. Paige chased them 50 yards down the slope. Then Puller was yelling for everyone to pull back to the ridge. They'd broken the assault, but they were still outnumbered. If they chased too far, the Japanese would regroup and surround them. The Marines fell back to their original positions. Paige collapsed behind his gun. His hands were shaking so badly he couldn't hold his rifle. His left hand was barely functional from the bayonet wound. Blood had soaked through both sleeves and one pant leg. He hadn't eaten since the previous evening. He hadn't slept in 36 hours. He'd been fighting for 13 hours straight. His body was shutting down. Puller brought water. Paige drank. A corpsman came up and tried to bandage his hand. Paige waved him away. The hand could wait. The Japanese were still out there. They would attack again. They always attacked again. But the attack didn't come. At 3 p.m., the ridge was silent. At 4 p.m., still nothing. Marine patrols moved forward cautiously through the battlefield. They counted bodies. Japanese dead carpeted the slope from the ridgeline down to the jungle. The patrols counted 473 bodies in front of Paige's original position alone. 473 Japanese soldiers had died trying to break through his section of the ridge. At 5 p.m., battalion headquarters sent word. The Japanese were withdrawing. The battle for Henderson Field was over. The Americans had held. Henderson Field was secure. The Guadalcanal campaign would continue. Paige sat behind his gun and stared at the jungle. He'd held this ridge for 15 hours. He'd fought alone for 6 of those hours. He'd fired thousands of rounds. He'd killed more Japanese soldiers than he could count. His platoon was gone, 32 Marines dead or wounded. He was the only one left. Someone from regimental headquarters arrived at 6 p.m. collecting after-action reports. They asked Paige what had happened. He told them, 1 platoon sergeant, 33 Marines, 4 machine guns, 2,700 Japanese soldiers. The headquarters officer wrote it down. Then he asked how many Japanese soldiers Paige thought he'd killed personally. Paige said he didn't know. He'd stopped counting after the first 100. The officer wrote that down too. At 7 p.m., as the sun set over Guadalcanal, Paige finally allowed the corpsman to bandage his hand. The bayonet had cut through tendons and nearly severed 2 fingers. The corpsman said Paige needed surgery. Paige said the hand could wait. He needed to help bury his Marines first. On October 27th, the day after the battle, Colonel Puller recommended Paige for the Medal of Honor. On December 19th, 1942, Paige was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the field. On May 21st, 1943, Marine Corps Commandant General Alexander Vandergrift presented Paige with the Medal of Honor in Melbourne, Australia. Paige put the medal in a cigar box and mailed it home to his parents. Then he returned to combat. He fought at Cape Gloucester. He fought in New Guinea. He stayed in the Pacific Theatre until July 1944. He never spoke about Guadalcanal unless someone asked directly. Years later, historians tried to determine exactly how many Japanese soldiers Paige had killed during those 6 hours he fought alone. They examined battlefield reports. They studied Japanese unit records. They calculated fields of fire and ammunition expenditure. The most conservative estimate was 140 Japanese soldiers killed by Paige personally during those 6 hours. The Browning M1917 machine gun was designed in 1917 by John Moses Browning. The weapon fired .30 caliber rounds from a cloth belt at a cyclic rate of 450 rounds per minute. The barrel was surrounded by a water-filled cooling jacket that prevented overheating during sustained fire. Without water in the jacket, the barrel would glow red after 200 rounds and warp after 500 rounds. With water, the gun could fire continuously for hours. The gun weighed 93 pounds fully loaded. The tripod weighed 53 pounds. A full ammunition can weigh 22 pounds and contain 250 rounds. To move a single gun required 3 men minimum. To operate it effectively in combat required constant coordination between the gunner, the loader, and the ammunition bearer. The loader had to feed the belt smoothly into the receiver while the gunner maintained aim. If the belt twisted or caught, the gun would jam. If the loader fed too fast or too slow, the rhythm broke and accuracy suffered. Paige had operated this gun for 6 years before Guadalcanal. He'd fired tens of thousands of rounds in training. He knew exactly how the weapon behaved under different conditions. He knew how the belt fed when wet from rain. He knew how the gun pulled left when the barrel heated. He knew the precise moment when the water jacket needed refilling. He knew these things instinctively because he'd trained until the gun became an extension of his own body. Most machine gunners in 1942 had 6 months of training. Paige had 72 months. Most gunners had fired perhaps 5,000 training rounds before combat. Paige had fired 10 times that amount. Most gunners understood the mechanical operation of the weapon. Paige understood the soul of it. He could hear when a jam was starting before it happened. He could feel when the barrel was beginning to overheat before the water boiled. He could sense when the ammunition belt was about to catch before the gun stopped firing. This expertise explains how Paige survived the first 2 hours alone. Training and experience kept his guns running when they should have failed. But training doesn't explain how he survived 6 hours. Training doesn't explain how he moved between multiple gun positions while under fire. Training doesn't explain how he reloaded belts with a bayonet wound through his left hand. Training doesn't explain how he kept fighting when his body should have collapsed from exhaustion. The human body has limits. Medical studies conducted after World War II analysed the physical demands of sustained combat. Researchers found that soldiers could maintain peak performance for approximately 2 hours under high stress. After 2 hours, fine motor skills began to deteriorate. After 4 hours, decision-making ability declined sharply. After 6 hours, most soldiers experienced complete physical and mental exhaustion. Paige fought alone for 6 hours. He maintained fine motor skills sufficient to clear gun jams in darkness. He made tactical decisions about which gun to fire and which direction to defend. He moved repeatedly between positions while carrying ammunition. He did all of this with significant wounds and no food or water. By every medical standard available, he should have collapsed after 3 hours. Some historians argue that adrenaline kept Paige functioning. The human body produces adrenaline during extreme stress. Adrenaline increases heart rate, dilates blood vessels, and releases glucose for immediate energy. It enables short bursts of enhanced performance, but adrenaline effects last minutes, not hours. The body cannot maintain adrenaline production for 6 hours straight. Eventually, the system crashes and the person collapses. Other historians point to Paige's training as the deciding factor. They argue that 6 years of experience created such deep muscle memory that Paige could operate the guns even while exhausted. The actions became automatic. Loading, firing, clearing jams all happened without conscious thought. This theory has merit but doesn't fully explain his endurance. A third theory focuses on psychology. Paige knew that if he stopped fighting, Henderson Field would fall. If Henderson Field fell, the Marines would lose Guadalcanal. If they lost Guadalcanal, Japan would control the Pacific. Paige understood the strategic importance of his position. This understanding created a psychological imperative stronger than physical exhaustion. He kept fighting because stopping wasn't an option. Probably all three factors contributed. Adrenaline provided initial energy. Training enabled automatic responses when conscious thought became difficult. Psychology maintained determination when his body demanded rest. The combination kept him alive and fighting for 6 hours that should have killed him. But there's a fourth factor that historians rarely discuss. Paige wasn't fighting for abstract strategic goals. He wasn't fighting for Henderson Field or Guadalcanal or the Pacific Campaign. He was fighting for 32 dead Marines lying in the mud around his position, his entire platoon. Men he'd trained, men he'd led, men who had trusted him to keep them alive. They were dead. He wasn't. And as long as he could still fire a gun, their deaths would mean something. The Japanese wouldn't break through. The ridge would hold. Henderson Field would survive. And 32 Marines wouldn't have died for nothing. This is what kept Mitchell Paige fighting when every physical and mental system in his body was screaming for him to stop. The battle for Henderson Field lasted from October 23rd to October 26th, 1942. The Japanese committed approximately 7,000 troops from the 17th Army to the offensive. The Americans defended with roughly 3,000 Marines and soldiers. The Japanese plan called for simultaneous attacks from multiple directions to overwhelm the American perimeter. If the plan succeeded, they would recapture Henderson Field and drive the Americans off Guadalcanal entirely. The battle was divided into multiple sectors. Paige defended the southern approach. Other Marine units defended the eastern and western approaches. The heaviest fighting occurred on the nights of October 24th and October 26th. Japanese forces launched coordinated assaults across the entire perimeter. Artillery bombardments preceded the infantry attacks. The goal was to break through at any weak point and exploit the gap. Paige's sector wasn't the only position that faced overwhelming odds. On the night of October 24th, 2 nights before Paige's stand, another Marine machine gun section came under similar attack. Sergeant John Basilone commanded that section. His unit was positioned northeast of Paige's location, defending a different approach to Henderson Field. Basilone's position was hit by approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers from the 29th Infantry Regiment. The attack began at 9 p.m. on October 24th. Within 2 hours, Basilone's machine gun crews were running low on ammunition. Basilone made repeated trips through Japanese fire to retrieve ammunition from rear areas. He carried the ammunition belts on his shoulders, running bent over through machine gun fire and mortar explosions. He made 4 trips. Each trip brought back enough ammunition to keep his guns firing for another 30 minutes. When 2 of Basilone's guns were knocked out, he repaired them under fire. When his gunners were wounded, he took over the guns himself. He fired continuously for 15 hours. By dawn on October 25th, Basilone's section had killed approximately 900 Japanese soldiers. The position held. Basilone received the Medal of Honor for his actions that night. 2 Medal of Honor recipients from the same battalion in the same battle defending the same airfield against the same enemy. Basilone on October 24th, Paige on October 26th. The 2 men never met during the battle. Their positions were separated by 2 miles of jungle, but they faced the same situation: overwhelming numbers, dead crew members, failing guns, impossible odds. and they both kept fighting until reinforcements arrived. The Japanese losses during the battle for Henderson Field were catastrophic. American forces counted approximately 2,000 Japanese dead across all sectors. Another 1,000 were wounded. The Japanese 17th Army had committed 7,000 troops to the offensive. Nearly half became casualties. The units that survived were no longer combat effective. The offensive failed completely. American casualties were significantly lower, but still substantial. The Marines lost 206 killed and 346 wounded during the 4-day battle. Some companies lost 50% of their strength. Some platoons were wiped out entirely. Paige's platoon suffered 97% casualties. 32 of 33 men were killed or wounded. Only Paige survived, unfit for further combat that day. The strategic consequences of the battle were enormous. Henderson Field remained in American hands. American bombers continued operating from the airfield. Japanese supply lines remained vulnerable to air attack. The Japanese couldn't reinforce their garrison on Guadalcanal fast enough to sustain offensive operations. Within 2 months, the Japanese would begin evacuating Guadalcanal entirely. Military historians consider the battle for Henderson Field the decisive engagement of the Guadalcanal campaign. Before October 26th, the outcome of the campaign was uncertain. Either side could have won. After October 26th, Japanese defeat was inevitable. The Americans had proven they could hold Henderson Field against the strongest attack the Japanese could launch. The Japanese had proven they couldn't retake the airfield no matter how many troops they committed. Paige's defense of the southern ridge was a small part of a larger battle, but it was a critical part. If the Japanese had broken through his sector, they would have reached Henderson Field from the south, while other units attacked from the east and west. The Americans would have faced encirclement. The defense would have collapsed. Henderson Field would have fallen. The entire Guadalcanal campaign would have failed. One platoon sergeant holding one ridge for 6 hours prevented that outcome. 32 dead Marines and one man who refused to stop fighting no matter what happened around him. That was the margin between American victory and Japanese success on Guadalcanal. That was how close the Pacific War came to taking a very different direction. On November 15th, 2003, Mitchell Paige died of congestive heart failure at his home in La Quinta, California. He was 85 years old. He'd retired from the Marine Corps in 1959 with the rank of colonel. He'd served for 24 years after Guadalcanal. He'd never spoken publicly about the battle unless directly asked. When asked, he always said the same thing. The Medal of Honor belonged to 33 Marines, not to him. The real heroes were the men who didn't come home. But there was something Paige did after the war that revealed how deeply Guadalcanal had affected him, something he dedicated the final decades of his life to accomplishing, something that connected directly to the 32 Marines who died on that ridge. In the years after World War II, a problem emerged regarding the Medal of Honor. People began claiming they'd received the award when they hadn't. Some did it for personal gain. They wore fake medals at public events, claimed veteran benefits they hadn't earned, told stories about heroic actions that never happened. Others did it for social status. Wearing a Medal of Honor brought respect and attention. Some people wanted that respect without earning it. This was more than simple fraud. The Medal of Honor represents something specific. It represents actions beyond normal duty. It represents soldiers who faced death and kept fighting anyway. It represents the absolute limit of human courage under the worst possible circumstances. When someone wears a fake Medal of Honor, they diminish every real recipient. They steal honor from men who actually earned it. Congress recognized this problem and made it a federal crime to falsely claim receipt of the Medal of Honor. The law carried penalties including fines and imprisonment, but enforcement was difficult. The military maintained records of Medal of Honor recipients, but those records weren't always easily accessible. Local police departments didn't have the resources to investigate every suspicious claim. Many fraudulent recipients continued operating for years without consequences. Mitchell Paige became personally involved in stopping this fraud. After retiring from the Marine Corps in 1959, he joined the Congressional Medal of Honor Society as a liaison officer. Part of his role involved working with the Federal Bureau of Investigation to identify false recipients. When someone claimed to have received a Medal of Honor, Paige would verify the claim against official records. If the claim was false, he would notify the FBI. The FBI would investigate and prosecute if sufficient evidence existed. Paige took this work seriously. He investigated hundreds of cases over several decades. He travelled to public events where fake recipients appeared. He examined their medals. He asked questions about their service. He checked their stories against historical records. When he found discrepancies, he reported them. Many prosecutions resulted from his investigations. People asked why Paige dedicated so much time to this work. He was a retired colonel. He could have spent his retirement relaxing. He'd earned that right. But Paige said the work was necessary. He said the Medal of Honor didn't belong to the people who received it. It belonged to everyone who served. It belonged especially to those who didn't survive. When someone wore a fake medal, they insulted every soldier who'd actually faced combat. They insulted every Marine who died in action. Paige was thinking about 32 specific Marines when he said this. His platoon, the men who died on that ridge on Guadalcanal. Those Marines had trusted him. They'd followed his orders. They'd died defending Henderson Field. Paige had survived. He'd received the Medal of Honor, but he understood that the medal represented all 33 Marines, not just him. When someone wore a fake Medal of Honor, they were stealing honor from those 32 dead Marines. This was personal for Paige. This was about protecting the memory of men who couldn't defend themselves. This was about ensuring their sacrifice maintained its meaning. This was about preventing fraudulent people from diminishing what those Marines had done on October 26, 1942. Paige worked on these investigations until his health declined in his final years. He personally helped identify and prosecute dozens of fraudulent Medal of Honor claims. He protected the integrity of the award. He protected the honor of men like John Basilone, who died at Iwo Jima in 1945. He protected the honor of the 32 Marines who died on that ridge at Guadalcanal. In 1998, toy company Hasbro created a G.I. Joe action figure based on Mitchell Paige. The figure wore a Marine Corps uniform and carried a machine gun. It was part of a series honoring Medal of Honor recipients from each branch of the military. Paige was selected as the Marine Corps representative. The figure came with a small booklet explaining his actions on Guadalcanal. Thousands of these figures were sold. A new generation of children learned about what happened on that ridge. In 1999, Paige received a star on the Palm Springs Walk of Stars. The ceremony recognized him as one of 5 Medal of Honor recipients from the Southern California desert area. Local veterans groups attended. Paige gave a brief speech. He said the star should honor all Marines who fought on Guadalcanal, not just him. He said the real heroes were buried in military cemeteries across the Pacific. A museum at Marine Corps Base 29 Palms was dedicated to Paige. The museum displayed his uniform, his Medal of Honor, and artifacts from Guadalcanal. Visitors could see the type of machine gun Paige had used. They could read his citation. They could learn about the battle for Henderson Field. The museum educated thousands of Marines about their history. It kept the memory of Guadalcanal alive for new generations. On March 23, 2003, 8 months before his death, Paige finally received his Eagle Scout Award. He'd earned the rank in 1936 at age 17, but had never received the physical award because he left home to join the Marines. The Boy Scouts of America held a ceremony 67 years later. Paige was one of only 7 men to be both an Eagle Scout and a Medal of Honor recipient. When Mitchell Paige died on November 15, 2003, he was the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the Guadalcanal campaign. John Basilone had died at Iwo Jima in February 1945. The other Guadalcanal recipients had passed away over the decades. Paige was the final living connection to those battles. With his death, the last eyewitness to what happened on Henderson Field was gone. Paige was buried with full military honors at Riverside National Cemetery in Riverside, California. Marines in dress blue uniforms carried his casket. A firing party fired 3 volleys. A bugler played taps. The flag that covered his casket was folded and presented to his family. Hundreds of Marines attended the funeral. They came to honor a man who had defined what it meant to be a Marine. They came to honor someone who had held the line when holding the line seemed impossible. The official citation for Paige's Medal of Honor describes his actions in formal military language. It states that he continued to direct the fire of his gunners until all his men were either killed or wounded. It states that he fought alone against the deadly hail of Japanese shells. It states that he moved from gun to gun, never ceasing his withering fire against the advancing hordes until reinforcements finally arrived. Then it states that he dauntlessly and aggressively led a bayonet charge, driving the enemy back and preventing a breakthrough in our lines. These words describe what happened, but they don't explain why it mattered. They don't explain what Henderson Field meant to the Pacific War. They don't explain what would have happened if Paige had stopped fighting. They don't explain the strategic consequences of one Marine holding one ridge for 6 hours. Henderson Field was the only operational American airfield in the Solomon Islands in October 1942. Without it, American bombers couldn't reach Japanese supply convoys. Without those bombers, Japan could reinforce and resupply their forces throughout the Pacific. The Japanese understood this. That's why they committed 7,000 troops to retaking the airfield. That's why they accepted catastrophic casualties trying to break through the Marine perimeter. Henderson Field was worth any price. If Paige's sector had collapsed on October 26th, the Japanese would have reached the airfield. They would have destroyed the bombers and fighters parked there. They would have captured the fuel dumps and ammunition stores. The Marines would have been forced to evacuate. Guadalcanal would have remained under Japanese control. The first American offensive in the Pacific would have failed. The strategic implications extend beyond Guadalcanal. American war planners based their entire Pacific strategy on controlling key islands and using those islands as airbases for further advances. Guadalcanal was the test case. If the strategy failed at Guadalcanal, it would be abandoned. The Pacific War would have taken a completely different course. The timeline for defeating Japan would have extended by years. Thousands of additional American lives would have been lost. This is what one Marine prevented by refusing to abandon his position. This is what 33 Marines died protecting. This is why their sacrifice mattered so profoundly to the outcome of World War II. Mitchell Paige understood this. He understood that October 26, 1942, wasn't just about holding a ridge or defending an airfield. It was about 32 Marines whose names most people would never know. It was about men who did their duty and died doing it. It was about making sure their deaths accomplished something meaningful. That's why he kept fighting when fighting should have been impossible. That's why he led a bayonet charge when charging was suicide. That's why he spent decades after the war protecting the honour of the Medal of Honor recipients, because honour was all those 32 Marines had left. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favour. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about machine gunners and platoon sergeants who held impossible positions with courage and training. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Mitchell Paige and those 32 Marines don't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.